First of all, I want to thank you all for coming out this evening. You could be anywhere else, but believe me, you're at a good place because some great people are going to be honored this evening, and I'm going to take a short period of this time as a speaker because I do love the history of Jersey City and the history of African Americans in Jersey City. I do have a lot of information to share, and sometimes you have to pull away from the politics and the craziness of government sometimes, and how I relax is researching and finding a good book that teaches me more about the history of Jersey City. And when I can, I take a few minutes, and it's not too often now, but I jot down a few lines because one of these days I'm going to finish a book that I've been working on for some time about the history of Jersey City. We're going to talk, as mayor of Jersey City, I'm so proud to be the mayor of the most diverse city probably in the entire United States of America. People of all colors and creeds and religions and races, and it's a wonderful city to be the mayor of. And I believe that it's very important for all of us to know everybody else's history. Just as I enjoy reading the history of African Americans, I've enjoyed researching the history of Irish Americans in Jersey City and Italian Americans in Jersey City, the Latinos and every other group, the Asians that come to Jersey City. It's important that we know everybody's history. But this is Black History Month. So tonight, it's an opportunity for people from throughout Jersey City to learn more about African Americans, especially right here in Jersey City. African Americans have been here since the first settlers were in this area. This story that I'm going to tell you goes back to 1640. Any of you who are good in arithmetic, I know we have the superintendent of schools here, he would tell you that's about 364 years ago, when the first African American came here. At first, along what's now downtown Jersey City, there are basically 4 little islands. One was an island that's Paulus Hook, which is by Exchange Place. Another island was Hoboken. Another one was out towards Communipaw. We're here at the foot of Communipaw Avenue, down where Liberty State Park is. That was one of the first areas. And actually, the Indians, of course, were here first. But after the Indians, there were 2 Indian uprisings in this area. And for 2 times, the people who settled on this side of the river, because New York was always bigger, even then, they had the Indian Wars, and they had to leave and go back over to what's now New York, which was then New Amsterdam. But in 1660, the governor and his statue was in front of one of the schools, Governor Stuyvesant, Peter Stuyvesant, said, okay, you can go back and settle the area across the river in what's now New Jersey, but you have to build 2 fortified villages. And the first village they built was down at the foot of Communipaw Avenue, the village of Communipaw, and then the more successful one was built up in Bergen, by Journal Square, around by Sip Avenue. But down here in Communipaw, there were a group of slaves. Now I'm going to talk about things, but it's history. And it's important to just know what history is. And when you hear the story, you'll be able to better appreciate how we've come from a period when the first black man came to Jersey City as a slave in 1660 to an African American being elected mayor and senator by all of the people of the city. So it shows you the greatness of America. But there were a group of Africans here that were called the Negroes, the Dutch Negroes of Communipaw. And that's a close-up of the same shot. And they were made, technology, click, oh, okay. They were made immortal by this writer, Washington Irving. Some of you may remember him. He wrote Rip Van Winkle and other stories during that period of time. But he wrote about the Dutch Negroes of Communipaw, and he explained how they were good at navigation and how they were good at farming and raising plants, and he wrote about them quite often. That was Washington Irving. Then there was the village of Bergen. Up in 1664, it was established. It basically went from, there's an old map of it, it went from Sip Avenue to Academy Street, and from what's now Summit Avenue and over to by Kennedy Boulevard. It had a big fence built around it. And everything that we see now, there were Africans there. In fact, Africans probably helped build the fortification. And the first African, once again, came, and I'll show you in a moment or two, but he came ashore down by where Newport Mall is located now. Up in the village of Communipore, right outside it, this was the first church, probably the first church in the entire state of New Jersey. And it was an octagonal building, 8-sided building, small church. One of the original members of this church was a man named Joachim Anthony. Now that's not really Joachim Anthony, but that's kind of how he would have been dressed. Joachim Anthony would have spoken fluent Dutch and probably also some remnants of an African language. He was one of the first 170 some odd members of that old Dutch church. If you go on Bergen Avenue today, you'll see the third building from that church is at Highland and Bergen right now across from the old cemetery. I still call it the old Dutch church, but it's now called, I think, the Reformed church. But Joachim Anthony was a member of that church, so I guess we can identify him as the first African-American Christian in what's now Jersey City. That's a drawing of the church that's there now, the old Bergen church. In 1664, just about the time that the Dutch settlers built the town of Bergen, all of a sudden things are going good, and what happened? The English came and took over, and they took over without firing a shot. They just brought all their warships into what's now New York Harbor and the Hudson River, and the Dutch surrendered, and the English took over. Now that was significant for black people because when the English took over, their form of slavery was more harsh than the Dutch. Slavery in any form is bad and evil, but the English brought even a more harsh slavery. There were less freedoms. Slaves were not allowed to marry. They were not allowed to join the church, and so life became worse after the English took over. These are just a few of the remnants of the early days of the town of Bergen. Some of you probably have eaten lunch and dinner in the Summit House up on, it's still at Summit Avenue. That's now a restaurant. Parts of that building was built originally in the 1700s. And we all know the Apple Tree House. I'm proud to say we've got some money we're putting into the Apple Tree House. They're out there doing some work on it now. This was a house where George Washington supposedly met under an apple tree out in the backyard with Lafayette, General Lafayette. And remember, when you see these houses, slaves lived in all of these houses, in all of these early houses. It was common for the Dutch citizens in this area to own 2 and 3 slaves. They didn't own 60 and 100 and 200 and 1,000 like occurred in the southern states because they didn't have the same kind of crops, cotton and tobacco. But they did have slaves to help with their farm work and their housework. And we'll talk about that in a moment. Oh, I skipped ahead. Okay, thank you. Thanks, Dan. There's a drawing of a house called the Old Sip House or the Sip Manor. That was located right on Bergen and Newkirk Street. There used to be a jewelry store there, Kate Finley. I forget what's there right now. But that building was one of the oldest buildings in Jersey City and one of the oldest in New Jersey. And it got dilapidated, as you can see at the bottom. But instead of destroying it, somebody was thinking of the future and they took it apart. They disassembled the old Sip Manor. And guess what they did with it? They gave it a new location. There it is now. That's at, I took that picture, or I took a picture like that, not that one, but that's at number 5 West Street in Westfield, New Jersey. So a big part of Jersey City's history is now located in Westfield, New Jersey. And there would have been slaves living in that house also. I'm going to show you now some evidence of slavery as existed in Jersey City, in what's now Jersey City. First of all, this is over in Amsterdam. This is a drawing of a slave sale on Wall Street. You know, Wall Street is called Wall Street today. We think of it as a big finance place. But in reality, it was Wall Street because there was a big wall built along parts of the town over there as the Dutch built it. And at one location along there, they would sell the slaves as they were brought into New York. Now remember, in those days, when you think of New Amsterdam, which was what New York was called then, this was considered New Amsterdam also. This was all part of Dutch New Netherlands. So the people here were connected in every way to what was the lifestyle in New York City, in New Amsterdam. This is an inventory when someone passed away. And you see the circle, you can't see it real well, but it says one Negro woman, $100, one Negro boy, $50. These and the third same one is the 3 people, and 1 Negro slave, the first one is referred to. This is actually an inventory of the property owned by a resident in the town of Bergen. When I say town of Bergen, remember all of us now, Jersey City was part of the town of Bergen. And Bergen, we were all part of Bergen County until 1840 when Hudson County became a separate county. So when we talk about the town of Bergen, though, we're referring to the area that's presently Jersey City. For example, in 1790 in Bergen County, which included Hudson County then, there were 2,300 slaves, which was about 1/6 of the total population. In 1800, there were 12,500 slaves in New Jersey, 1810, 10,009, and on down to 1840, there were 674. The day the first bullet was fired in the Civil War, there was still a handful of slaves in the state of New Jersey. Only 1 in Hudson County then. There was 1 left in North Bergen. And we'll kind of find out how that happened as we go along. Thank you. There we go. This building here is no longer there. It was torn down in 1909. Its last use was that of a boating club. It was at the foot of Linden Avenue on the Hudson River. Now it's kind of an industrial area, but it was built in 1760 by Captain Thomas Brown. Captain Thomas Brown became very wealthy by bringing slaves directly from Africa into New Jersey, including some obviously to New York and Jersey City itself. This building, as I said, was torn down in 1909. When it was torn down, they found the shackles that they used to hold slaves in the basement of the building. This building was down just about where 4th Street and Marion Boulevard is today, just across from the Newport Mall parking lot. Where the Newport Mall is, that was all water, so it was all filled in there. But there was this Van Voss plantation owned by Cornelius Van Voss. When he died, his wife became the owner of the property, and Mr. Stoffelson, I think, who had been the builder of the fort over in New Amsterdam, he then married the widow and became the owner of the property. And this is the spot where the first African ever to come to what's now Jersey City, and probably New Jersey, came ashore at this location. And how do I know about that? Because Mr. Stoffelson was a great entertainer. And one day there was a ship that pulled up just about where Newport Mall is. The captain of the ship was invited to Stoffelson's home. The captain of the ship was so happy with the way he was treated that he gave Mr. Stoffelson a gift. And what do you think that gift was? A human being, a slave. I don't know his name. I know I can get it, at least the first name, by traveling up to Albany, New York, because it's in the court records there. But the reason we know that this happened was the stepson of Stoffelson didn't like Stoffelson. And he went to court over in New Amsterdam, and he said that he should own half of that human being, because at the party that they had, there were 2 sheep consumed, and he owned half of the property, so he owned half of the sheep. So because he sued over ownership of that sheep, we found that this first black man came to Jersey City at that time. By the way, Sandy would get me later and remind you, about a year before 1640, when that man came, the first black woman was here at the foot of Communipaw Avenue. I forget the gentleman's name right now who was the owner of that slave, but he became noted because they thought there was some affair going on between him and his slave. And so the burgomasters or the officials from New Amsterdam and New York had to come over to chastise him. So that became a matter of record. I'm sorry, would you go back one more time? This is another record of a shipload of slaves that was brought from Africa right over into New York City, and some of those probably into what's now Jersey City. All over Jersey City, and this is not a good picture, but you'll see reminders of slave owners in Jersey City. People like the Van Horns, Zabriskie, Gautier, Clendenny, Van Horn, not so much John Van Horn, and there are a few others up there, and the picture's a little bad, my memory's faded on it. But these, every time I drive through Jersey City, I see streets that are named after former slaveholders from what's now Jersey City. In spite of slavery, slaves ran away. Mr. Brunson is here. And by the way, Mr. Brunson is the true griot of history, black history in Jersey City. So at the end of the session, he'll tell me what I said wrong or not quite right. But maybe he won't say it too loud. But he's helped identify a spot in Jersey City where we feel that runaway slaves ran to and hid. And that was before the era of the runaway railroad even. And that's down where Cornelius Avenue is, where what are the projects there? The Montgomery Gardens, housing development, and that general area was like a swamp and cedar wooded area, and the slaves would run there and hide until they were rounded up again by the slave owners. This is a record at the bottom of a slave who was identified as a mulatto servant man, and he escaped from William Bayard's farm in Hubak. Anybody knows where Hubak is? Hoboken. Right. He probably, even then, he was probably coming to Jersey City. It was a little better. But he came from Hubak, and Hoboken gets his name from the Indians. It means Habaking, which means the land where we get, and I'm saying the long way, where we get the stones to make our tobacco pipes. The Indians found a special stone in Hoboken where they would make their tobacco pipes out of. But this shows you that nobody wanted to be in slavery, and every time people had an opportunity to escape, they did. This is a story about an ad from a newspaper about another runaway from Paulus Hook, and that's, of course, right in downtown Jersey City, a Negro man called Osborne, and it gives him a description. I found about 30 advertisements of slaves who escaped from either Jersey City, Bayonne, or Hoboken, but I have here just one or two. Then the Revolutionary War came up during the 1770s. All right, Stan, there you go. Down at the intersection of Washington Street and Grand Street, you see the kind of four little parks right on the corner? That's where the Paulus Hook Fort was. And there was a general named Light Horse Harry Lee, who actually was the father of Robert E. Lee, who became famous during the Civil War. He was one of George Washington's commanders, and he requested permission to invade Paulus Hook. Up until then, the Americans weren't doing too well in the Revolutionary War. The first few years, they were actually losing it pretty bad. They wanted to attack this fort. The fort was built by George Washington and his men, but when the British came into New York Harbor, they were so strong that George Washington fled, and they went over to Morristown or someplace, and the British then took over this fort. So now the British were occupied there. The Americans needed a victory, at least a symbolic victory, so they decided to attack Paulus Hook. Before they could get into Paulus Hook, they had to do some spying. So how did they get into the fort? There was a black slave named Cujo, and he was obviously born in Africa because he still had his African name. Cujo means Tuesday or Monday, I forget which one, in one of the African languages. I'm sorry, Tuesday, thank you, Sam. So she's doing her job. And Tuesday, don't forget that land was all swampy. The soldiers were camped up, Washington's people were camped up by where Dickinson High School is, because it was a high ground, and they can kind of look down into that area. It was all swamped and wooded. They had to get into the area, and Cujo befriended two of George Washington's people, or Light Horse Harry Lee's people, and they were in civilian clothes, so he took them into the fort as his friends. They were able to spy and see where the guns were, how many weapons they had, where the ammunition was, how many soldiers were there. Then on the way out, they had to kill the sentries, because now they're going to bring down Washington's troops, and they invaded Paulus Hook, and we know the success of that story, but that would not have happened if it were not for Cujo. During the Revolutionary War, the British leaders who were over here, like Lord Dunmore and others, were saying, well, we have to get the Africans, or the African Americans who are here to fight with us. Now, we know that more than 5,000 African Americans fought with the Americans during the Revolutionary War. Even though in the beginning they didn't want them, but as the war went on, they realized they needed them. But what we don't always know is that another 5,000 fought with the British. Now, we're all patriots, but if you were a slave in the 1770s, why not? Because the British were promising you freedom. Most of the blacks who fought with the Americans after the war were returned to slavery. Those who went with the British were given freedom, and at the end of the war, they were transported to Nova Scotia and different places. This is just an advertisement where Sir Henry Clinton was encouraging African Americans to flee to the British lines and help them. Right in Bayonne, at about 53rd Street, almost where the entrance to the turnpike is now. In Bayonne, there was a fort there called Fort Delancey. That's a drawing of how it might have looked. And a lot of the the escaped blacks who ran away during slavery from Jersey City and the town of Bergen, they would go out there and they served with the British. And they were used to, as soldiers, and also to go out and gather wood and harass the surrounding areas. So they basically fought with the British under a man named Captain Ward. The Underground Railroad. Prior to that, Dred Scott was an African American who went to court to try to get his freedom, and he lost the court case, but it resulted in the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. Now, what did the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 say? It said basically, if a slave escaped, every citizen in the United States was obligated to help catch that slave, which meant you couldn't help the slave to escape. It was against the law. It was against the federal law. And I was a little embarrassed as a former U.S. Marshal, because it was a federal crime if you violated and you actually helped the runaway slave. So the U.S. Marshals in those days would actually have to track down the fugitive slaves. But as a result of that, it became very illegal to help slaves. That's why helping slaves became an underground movement, an underground railroad. It had to be done in secret. That's why there are very few records of people who admitted to helping fugitive slaves. Some slaves escaped on the Mars Canal. This is a drawing of the Mars Canal as it went through part of Jersey City, down by Van Horn Street, I think this was, in the Lafayette section. Slaves could get on those boats, make deals with the captains, get down to the waterfront. This is just a drawing of a slave being punished for running away. This is one of my favorite houses in the whole world. It's right across the street from where I was born, and many of us were born. Who was born in Margaret Haig Hospital here? All right. When you were a little baby and you first looked out the window, right across the street, there's this house that's still there today. I call it the Underground Railroad House. It's at 79 Clifton Place. And it was built by a white man by the name of Colonel David Holden. David Holden was an abolitionist. He opposed slavery. I believe when he built this house in about 1853, he knew he was going to be helping slaves to escape. On Clifton Place in 1853, you can stand on his porch or look out the top window, and you can see the whole waterfront. There was no medical center behind him. There was a drop in the cliff, and then woods and swamps, and then you can see the waterfront. So he would hide slaves in his basement, and I went down in that basement. I've been in the house several times. He has a great big kind of Dutch oven where you can imagine 15, 20 people sitting around that oven fireplace to keep warm. Until just a few years ago, the descendants of David Holden were still living there. I took this picture about maybe 5 years ago. At the time, the older lady on your left, Mrs. Margaret Hilton, I believe her name was, Elizabeth Hilton, was still living there. Her husband had just died. I met him, but he passed away. And this is her family. And they all know the history of that family and that building. And about 3 years ago, they sold the house, and she had to move with them because of advancing age. That's another picture of the family. And behind them is Colonel Holden himself. That's a picture of Colonel Holden. And the young fellow has a Civil War rifle that his grandfather used. This shows you how our waterfront would have looked. This is 1877, but like 15 years earlier, 10 years earlier, it didn't look much different. And that shows you where the goal of the fugitive slaves was to get down to that waterfront. That's another picture of the waterfront. Van Winkle, he wrote one of the histories of Jersey City. And what's interesting about him, he tells a story one time of actually seeing a fugitive slave on the escape, and when they escaped, they had the help of other people, black or white, that were assisting them. And this slave got down to what's now the waterfront area, at the foot of Grand Street probably, and and he was seen by a slave catcher. Some people got jobs. Their job was trying to track down the fugitive slaves as they came into Jersey City, because there were maybe 5 to 10 different trails leading into Jersey City on the Underground Railroad. And he saw the slave finally escape, and they hit him under a bunch of coal on one of the barges, and then the barge pulled off, and the slave eventually escaped, and hopefully got all the way to Canada. William Still is one of the famous, well-known African-American agents on the Underground Railroad, but most agents we cannot identify him because it was a violation of the federal law, so very few of them are known. There are 3, Mr. Holt was one of the agents in Jersey City, and there are 2 others, John Everett and another gentleman whose name passes me right now. But the slaves could not have been successful without the help of these folks who were helping them along the way. Civil War. When the Civil War broke out, at first African Americans were not allowed to fight for this country. Even though they had fought already in all the other wars. They had fought in the Revolutionary War, they fought in the War of 1812, they fought in the Indian Wars. Now we had this war, North and South, and they were not allowed to fight. But this is an ad from Jersey City Public Library of a unit that was starting up in Jersey City, but there were no blacks in this unit. This is another depiction of Civil War soldiers coming through Jersey City. Jersey City was a major transportation center, and they were passing through Jersey City on their way down to the south. Frederick Douglass, one of my favorite people in the whole world. Frederick Douglass came to Jersey City on several occasions, and one time he came to Jersey City in 1863 on February 18th, and he spoke, and look at his subject, the sure way to crush the rebellion. Now, I found him speaking in Hoboken a few months earlier or later, and I have the whole speech because a reporter took it in longhand and wrote the whole speech down. His speech in Jersey City, he did not, I don't know word for word what he said, but I know just about what he was talking, because the sure way to crush the rebellion. On February 18th, they still didn't allow black troops into the Civil War, except there were some in the South, some generals were disobeying the law and bringing them in parts of the South and down in New Orleans. But for the most part, they weren't recruited. And Frederick Douglass was saying, if you want to end the rebellion, the Civil War, the way to crush the rebellion is to employ African-American troops so they can help fight for their own freedom. And 2 months later, he won that battle, and the black troops came in. You'll find out about 188 to almost 200,000 black troops served. And the North was not winning until that time. They were depleting all their troops, and we'll hear about that in a moment. But he spoke at a church called Bethesda Baptist Church on South 4th Street in Jersey City. I don't believe it's connected at all to the Bethesda today, which is a black church. This would have been a white church. In fact, the full name of that church was the Bethesda Baptist Church and Anti-Slavery Church. It had the word anti-slavery actually in their name. So it was a white church that took a big stand against slavery. A lot of the other churches at the time did not. In fact, there were no black churches until then. This is just a symbol of the U.S. colored troops, that's what they were called. And this is an ad put out now recruiting colored volunteers. New Jersey did not recruit black soldiers in the Civil War. So New Jersey has a very poor history of supporting African American causes in the early years. But they did take credit when somebody joined. But they would have to go into Philadelphia and other states to join, but New Jersey did take credit. This is where a place they trained in Philadelphia. Stan, help me. Okay. All of the soldiers in the Civil War, I'm sorry. The black soldiers served, but their officers were white. This is an officer in one of the U.S. colored troop regiments. He was a white doctor from Jersey City, Dr. Mortimer Lamson, and he served as a surgeon during the Civil War. And I happened to find his obituary when he died, like in the 1890s or so, and that's how I got a hold of that picture. Obituaries are good, you get a lot of information from them. The Decatur Dorsey is a black Civil War veteran who is buried at Hoboken Cemetery. Does anybody know where Hoboken Cemetery is? It's not in Hoboken, it's in North Bergen. The Hoboken Cemetery is in North Bergen at the cemetery off the boulevard, but he's a Medal of Honor winner who lived in Hoboken. The draft riots of 1863 were the worst riots in the history of this country. Worse than Watts, worse than New York, worse than Detroit, worse than Newark. And this is a riot where many blacks were actually hung on lampposts in New York City. That's a depiction. They were burned in their homes. Their businesses were destroyed because President Lincoln now had to draft soldiers. And many of the new immigrants coming into New York felt that they were being drafted to go to war to free slaves. And at that point in time, the U.S. was just getting ready to bring blacks themselves into the fighting. So that's the worst draft riot. That was out of a newspaper article recently from the movie. During the draft riot, an interesting thing happened. The blacks in New York were so afraid they were fleeing to Jersey. So some who had come here must have known of this area, and they went out to Curry's Woods and they hid. That was Curry's Woods in those days. Now we know Curry's Woods as a large housing project. Go back to that church. Oh, thank you, sir. This church is no longer there, but it was right around the corner from City Hall on York Street and Henderson. And when it was last up, it became an Elks Hall. But this is an interesting story in black history. When the blacks fled from New York during the draft riots, some of them went to this church and they hid up in the balcony. The minister actually hid them. Reverend Holmes and Chauncey Hope. Blacks were hiding, and because of all the excitement in New York, an angry crowd from Jersey City gathered around the church and demanded that they give them these blacks who were hiding in the church. The pastor refused, and Chauncey Hope managed to get some of the board of trustees of the church, and they were in front of the church with these ice pick candles that they had gotten. And they fended off the crowd, and eventually the crowd dispersed. Interestingly, I found an old letter in the library that Chauncey Holt had written in 1911, and he said he had given his ice pick candle to the Jersey City Public Library. So I wanted to find that axe handle, and I went up to what was then the Jersey City Museum, which is now on Montgomery Street, but was then over the Public Library building. And after about a half an hour, guess what I found? Nobody knew what it was, but it had a little tag on it with Chauncey Holt's name and the date and a little 3-line description of what happened. But most people still don't know the whole story. I'm hoping that we can get that axe handle and turn it over to Ted Brunson's museum up on the boulevard pretty soon. Most blacks before 1855 or so went to the white churches. That's one of the white churches. This is a newspaper article I found in 1853 that talked about raising money for the first African church that they wanted to build in Jersey City. It was built the money was raised mostly by white ministers. There was a ministerial alliance, and they were trying to raise money to help build a black church, and this shows they started. That building up on the top of the hill, I'm pretty sure that's the church. No, I found this picture not even in Jersey City. I found it doing my research. I think I found it out in Utah at the museum out there. But that would show you where Cornelius Avenue would be about where that train is running, and up on the hill would be where the Block Drugs building is now. And you still see those rocks up at the foot of Academy Street and Mill Road. This church is St. Mark's, the first St. Mark's church that was built. The other church was built in the town of Bergen. This one was the roots of the first black church that ended up being in what was Jersey City, which was downtown. The other church was had become the town of Bergen. This is Salem Baptist Church, a drawing of it. Some of you here probably go to Salem. An interesting history with this church is that it was first owned by the White Baptist Church, and the African Americans who went to that church had to sit in the balcony. And eventually the blacks tired of sitting in the balcony, and they went and formed their own church, and then years later came back and brought Salem, and own it today. This is one of the noted black members of what's now Metropolitan Church in Jersey City, but formerly St. Mark's. And this person here is, we don't know the jewels that we have or had right in our city. This is Reverend Alexander Walters, who was one of the original founders of the national NAACP out of the Niagara movement, when he and W.E.B. Du Bois and others first got together to form the national NAACP. And he lived right on Duncan Avenue in Jersey City. I've got a lot of newspaper clippings from his period in Jersey City. And he was very progressive because he encouraged women also to become clergy persons. And this is Reverend Florence Spearing Randolph, also a member of St. Mark's, who later went on to establish 5 churches in the state of New Jersey. This is very graphic, and this picture's a little squashed up. This is the local newspaper in 1850. And you can see the wording, "We've got them, the niggas still topsy-turvy." That was the depictions they used when there was an election and the side who was supporting abolition of slavery in the South actually would have lost. And of course, if it turned out that the wrong side won to them, then they would print something like that. Reading the newspapers, if you didn't appreciate it for history, could make you very, very, very angry in those days, but this is history. But they didn't want to take everybody's property. So what they did, they said, any child born of a slave mother after July 4th, 1804 would remain a slave for 21 years, I think, if a man, or 25 years if a man, and 21 years if a woman, which meant that when they became a certain age, they would be free. Anybody who was born right before 1804, July 4th, would be a slave for life. That's why you still had slaves in Jersey City 20, 30, and in New Jersey 20, 30, and 40 years later. This is a slave document signed by the citizens of what's now Jersey City, the town of Bergen, in which they were protesting the abolition of slavery. And they felt it was taking their property from them unfairly, and that there were certain inherent dangers. All these names you see here, there are many others on the list: Daniel Van Rypen, Cornelius Van Rypen. These are all people, Everett, Newkirk, these are all people who are right from what's now Jersey City. However, the abolition of slavery did make some changes. The gradual abolition law. After 1804, you had to report the births and deaths of slavery, and that was of slaves. That was considered progress, actually. They also had to, you start seeing more manumissions, more freedom papers given to slavery, and this is copies of original documents involving freeing of slaves in what's now Jersey City. Gradual abolition still permitted the breakup of slave families. There was a movement to send, and this is an interesting story, there was a movement to send slaves from the United States, freed slaves, back to Africa. Now you have to understand, in the 1800s, 1812 and 1830, 1840 and 50, most of the African Americans had been born right here in America. But it was led by Paul Cuffey, who actually had his own shipping company, and he thought he was doing the right thing, and he was transporting blacks back to Africa. He was an African American. But he was opposed by most black leaders, people like Samuel Cornish and Henry Highland Garnett, and they opposed that, especially through Freedom's Journal and other communications. This is a copy of a newspaper article I found. It says African colonization. It talks about the Hudson County chapter, of which the first mayor of Jersey City was the president, in which they actually would raise money to get ships to send black people to Liberia. And I have one article where one of the ships was right in Jersey City, and the article said, if you want to return to Africa, bring 2 references and see Dudley Gregory. He was the former mayor of Jersey City. And if you wanted to go back, you can go back. There's Mayor Dudley Gregory there, and you'll also see him somewhere up here on the wall. There's also the Free Soil movement. As the Civil War approached, the question became, would new territories be slave or free? And that caused a lot of political feuding. And this shows you the states that were slave states and free states, and the places like Kansas and Nebraska where there were battles over whether they would be free or not. And you had people taking, go back one second. You had people taking various stands. This is an article I found talking about a meeting of the Free Soil movement in Jersey City at Washington Hall. And once again, the mayor of Jersey City, I believe, is part of that also. But these were people who felt they didn't want to expand slavery any further than it was. Early African-American family in Jersey City was the Jacksons. And this is a little piece of an old map. And you can see along here, Jackson Avenue. Now, I know today we have Jackson Avenue that has become Martin Luther King Drive. There's also Jackson Avenue, this map clearly shows, that went from Ocean Avenue back to the North Bay, which also, that name came from the Jackson family that owned a big piece of property up in that area, and Mr. Brunson can tell you a lot about them also. There was the Jackson family in Greenville. There were farmers and oystermen and early property holders in Jersey City. Along Mill Road, I found a description of an area they called the Negro Colony. And actually it was kind of a street along where Block Drugs is now, Academy and Mill Road. And that seems to have been one of the early black neighborhoods, maybe in the 1830s. One of the first black businessmen I found was William Innes. He owned a hairdressing emporium at number 10 North Avenue in Jersey City downtown, and he had private rooms for dressing ladies' hair. Now, ironically, he did not do African American. When he did, probably his customers had to be well-to-do, and most African Americans probably could not have afforded to go to Mr. Innes. But I found about 6 or 7 advertisements of his shop during the 1960s. These are some other articles I found on Mr. Innes, and his wife also was an assistant, but he was a very successful businessman during that period of time. Daisy Fearing, one of my favorite people, Jersey City's first African-American school teacher. And this is an article, headline, "Want No Dark Girl Teacher." Jersey City parents object to colored instructors, over white children, etc. She had graduated from the Jersey City Teaching School, which was then on Bay Street. And she had like either the highest grades or among the highest grades. But when she went to be a teacher, everybody went ahead of her. And she fought and fought and fought. She lived on, I found out through the census records that she lived on, I think, Randolph Avenue, just where that little park is now, Randolph and Bayview. And she finally got the job. The person who helped her was Henry Snyder, who became the superintendent. And Snyder High School is named after him. But he was influential in trying to help her. This is when she actually went to work, and after a lot of fanfare, the story basically says that there wasn't too much trouble after all. Daisy Fearing in 1898. What was that? Oh. Now, when I say she was the first teacher, you got to realize that was in the regular public school system. Before that, the blacks were taught in the church. The 2 churches I showed you before, they had a schoolroom. So they had a segregated school system where the blacks were sent to a one-room school in the house, in the basement of the 2 churches, of the black churches. And Miss Martha Louise Ito was the principal. And before that, I have articles of her, like from the late 50s, being a teacher in what they called the colored school. So that was before they integrated the colored school with the regular public school system. They were paid less money. I've got articles where the church was taking a big stand fighting to improve the conditions in that school. I have to share that with you, Charlie. I've got some good things. Oops. We're just about done. Okay, Dr. George Epps Cannon, a physician in Lafayette section, a great man way ahead of his time. We could really use his help now. He was a doctor. He died in 1925. He got off his bus after a late night meeting, and by the time he walked across the street to his house, he collapsed and was dead. A lot of us think that he might have been beaten up by Mayor Haig's goons at that time. Because don't forget, he was a Republican. He seconded the nomination of President Harding. So you know he had to be of national renown. He was the founder of the Lafayette Presbyterian Church, which is now Claremont Lafayette Presbyterian Church. He was the founder of the Frederick Douglass Movie Company. They made at least three movies to counteract the race movies that were put out, like the Klansman story.
Birth of a Nation.
Birth of a Nation, thank you, Camille. And he also established what was basically a black bank on Kearney Avenue, Kearney, as we sometimes say, and Hart Street, which actually was a lending and loan institution that he founded. So he was way ahead of his time, Dr. Cannon. His daughter was Gladys Nunnery, and some of you are my age, she might have been your teacher. His daughter was my teacher my 5th grade teacher in PS number 29 school. And that's when he ran for the General Assembly. So he was way ahead of his time. And there's one person I didn't put up there, the colored policeman. Did I have the colored policeman? I'll just have to tell you about that. By mistake, it's not on there. Having been a law enforcement officer, I was always proud of the role that black policemen played in Jersey City. The first black man to become a policeman in Jersey City was George Harris in 1880. It was after the Civil War, and the politicians promised the black community that if they supported their candidate, they would appoint a black policeman. And the Republicans, in fact, appointed, most blacks were Republicans then. They appointed George Harris as a policeman, and I meant to put the articles up there, but the first one has him going out on patrol. His first night of patrol, 250 angry white citizens surrounded the police station to keep him from going on patrol. He went out anyway. The next day, the paper reported that he made just about all the arrests that were made. The third or fourth night, he went out and he was attacked by a group. They were throwing potatoes at him. And he went to make an arrest, and the crowd gathered around, and finally the captain and the policeman came out the district and helped him finish making the arrest. But he was the first black policeman. I don't think he was on too long. I don't think he lasted more than 2 or 3 months, I'm guessing. And it wasn't until 1925 when the first 3 African Americans through civil service were appointed to the police department. One of those is a very well-known person. He became a sergeant, and it slips me right now. Gene doesn't know, Sandy doesn't know. Yes, Isom, thank you. Sergeant Isom. And I didn't know the greatness of this man, but when I was a rookie policeman, I was assigned to go to a funeral one time, and we had to carry the casket out of this person who they told me was Sergeant Isom, a retired police officer, and he, of course, had died. But at the time, I didn't realize the greatness of the person, so now I realize it was an honor that I was able to participate in that last event in his life. Ladies and gentlemen, that brings my little lecture to a close, and I just want to say that coming from 1640, when the first black man came to us now, Jersey City, to what we have today, I'm very proud to be the first African American mayor of Jersey City. We have the first superintendent of schools over here. And I'm sorry, second. Okay, I'm sorry. Well, that's real progress. First is nice. Second means it's normal, and that's good. All right. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very, very much.